Hi.
Hi, thank you.
Well, apologies. Good afternoon. I wanted to focus my questions around international issues and cooperation. Starting with Professor Gopinath, I was wondering if you could just talk us through the emerging and low-income economies and the kinds of challenges they faced, which ones have been hit the hardest by the outbreak, and which are the most vulnerable, and what sort of interventions are most effective for those countries?
Thank you. This is a truly global crisis, unlike the global financial crisis, which was, we had advanced economies in recession, but emerging and developing economies growing. This time, everybody is in recession. And emerging markets and developing economies, low-income countries are being hit on multiple fronts. So it's a health crisis, but for several, it's a big drop in their commodity export prices. And so that's having a very large effect. Several of these countries, they rely very heavily on tourism, getting hit very hard. They rely very heavily on remittances, and the kinds of job losses that we've seen are usually tied to migrant workers, and they're getting hit very hard. And in the period of March, when we had these very volatile financial market conditions, they were hit hard in terms of foreign financing. Now, I don't think there's any way there is the risks to these economies are very large, and they have large financing needs, and several of them, especially low-income countries, about half of them entered this crisis with debt already in distress or in high likelihood of being in distress. And as this crisis has called for more spending, many emerging markets have had to incur bigger deficits and causing debt to GDPs to rise as the economies have contracted. And so now they are also entering the space of being very vulnerable on the debt front. So I think there are, in terms of what works, the first thing is that this is a crisis where spending needs to be done. There is critical spending needs in the health sector, in ensuring people have livelihoods. And so the first need is emergency financing. And that's what we have done at the IMF. We about 70 countries have received rapid financing from us. That's the first requirement. Secondly, there are several of these economies that have their debt payments coming due, and this is not the time for them to be making those payments. They should be having that income for other purposes. So debt relief, debt suspension, those initiatives are very important, and we have at the IMF have done debt service relief for some of our poorest members, for about close to over 25 of them. So that is the second, but I suspect there will be continuing need for concessional financing.
Yeah.
For financing in the form of just aid and grants for several of the low-income countries for a prolonged period. This is not going away anytime soon. They will also need technical expertise in dealing with this crisis, especially those with poor health capacities. Yeah. For a large number of emerging and developing economies, so far this crisis, there was the March turbulence, but right now, because financial markets have rebounded in a lot of places, and because of the very large central bank support for many of the major central banks and the swap lines, you've seen that their borrowing costs have come down, the spreads have come down. So they are in a situation where their external borrowing is not under stress. So that, I would say, is a priority, is to ensure that the international environment is such that they're able to access liquidity at reasonable rates, and to do whatever the necessary spending that's required. So that's the difference between the emerging markets and the low-income countries.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Just for both of you, and perhaps if Dr. Boone could come in on this point as well, could you set out what would happen if countries, the wealthier countries that provide billions of pounds of overseas development assistance and support, if they started to go into retreat? We are seeing in our own country the merger of the DFID with Foreign Office. There are concerns that if there is a rolling back of overseas aid and emergency as well as development aid, that will make matters worse. And given the interdependencies around this pandemic and how we tackle it, what is your sense of what would happen if development aid was in retreat around the world in those economies, particularly some of the poorest?
Thanks. Well, effectively, official development assistance in particular has played a key role, as you know, in promoting health and social protection system in developing countries. So we have been looking at what happened in previous recessions, and especially the financial crisis. And in fact, what it's difficult to see a depression of ODA level because the member of the Development Assistance Committee have tend to maintain, even so they usually state their ambition as a share of GNI or GDP, as you know, they have tend to maintain their contribution. And this time again, during the last Development Assistance Committee, they have confirmed that they will try and protect their ODA budget during the COVID crisis. Obviously, many of the ODA budgets were finalized before the outbreak of COVID-19. So there will need to be some revisiting of this because, as I said, they are expressed as proportion of GNI.
In your view, what would be the impact if countries started to cut back because of the pressure, domestic pressure, obviously? We can understand where the pressure, political pressure might come. We're certainly feeling it. What is the impact on those economies, on those countries, if there's a shift away from what you've got at the moment?
Well, I can think of two immediate impacts, which would be of very high concern. One is on the funding of the healthcare system, which obviously needs some of this money. The other is all the informal workers, and we have seen how some of the emerging market economies have actually developed or used digital tools to reach out to the informal workers who haven't obviously fall through the trap of social safety net. And we would fear that they would be much more affected if we didn't get this support. And looking ahead, I think it will be super important to ensure once a vaccine is developed, that it's manufactured and deployed in large quantities also to those countries.
Okay. Thank you. I've just got one last question, and I've got about 3 minutes. So this one is in relation to some of the issues around UK retail companies, but I think it applies to either European and American companies as well, who've been involved in the practice of, in sectors like garments factories in countries like Bangladesh, the practice of not paying for contracts or paying for orders that have been made. So in a country like that, over 80% of exports are in the garment sector. What can be done at the international level to address these types of issues? Because there'll be parallels for other sectors as well. And are you playing a role in enabling and ensuring that this is addressed? There's two sets of issues, obviously, because some of these companies will be under pressure financially, but others don't have financial pressures, but have cancelled contracts or cancelled orders, and that's putting millions of people at risk.
True. So we have, as you know, aid for trade, which would help to actually address some of this barrier that limit the contribution of trade to both. And there's some committee working on this. It's much of a concern for us, so we are trying to put pressure on to increase on this side the precise aid for trade, as I was saying, especially for that it reaches also the small and very small actually enterprises, which tends to be priced out of international market very quickly, and that's the example that you were highlighting.
Dr. Gopinath, did you want to add anything on this or any of the other points?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to your question about the need for aid. You know, if you look at the projections of what's going to happen to poverty in these parts of the world, it is really, it's really sad. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the World Bank numbers for people that will live with less than $3.20 a day, I mean, that number could increase by about 40 million to 150 million. So right. This is a a crisis that, you are going to see deep distress. I mean, a country like the UK having a negative growth rate of 10% is very different from a low-income country having a negative growth rate of 10%, which already starts out with very low per capita incomes, and the distress is tremendous.
Thank you. Thank you, Rushanara. Could we go to